Okay. Good morning. Today's shir is sponsored by the Nishmas of Shaila. I don't see any food yet, but I think the food will be here eventually. Last week we ended off talking about the story of the Bach's life. So we ended off talking about the Bach's brief, or maybe not so brief, sojourn through Gehenim, and his ability to pull out, different neshamas that were trapped there and bring them with him. Now that concept of a tzaddik being able to do that is discussed extensively. The Rabbinic talks about it, the Shlot talks about it, the Bach himself talks about it, and the Neder Yehuda talks about it, and obviously in the more explicitly Kabbalistic Svarim it's talked about more explicitly. Now I just decided we'll go down this rabbit hole for 1 week of Gehenim a little bit, and then we'll get back on track. So the way I want to come at this is as follows. In 2001, an ancient remnant of a shul, maybe possibly the oldest shul in the Americas, not America, but the Americas, like South America, North America, the oldest shul in this whole side of the world was refurbished. They discovered the ancient mikveh that had been in the basement of the shul. They figured out which buildings were the shul, and they refurbished it and turned it into what could be called an active shul today. I think it was called the Tzor Yisrael Shul. It was in Recife, Brazil. Recife, Brazil is like northeast Brazil. It's like like on the northeast corner of Brazil. They took this ancient shul, they found the mikveh, they built it into a sanctuary, and it looks exactly how a shul from the 1600s would look. And this became like a cultural icon of Brazilian Jewry, and people go there to make their bar mitzvahs and their bat mitzvahs and their dinners and events. It became like a very central. Now, there was a Chabad Shliach in São Paulo, Brazil, a much bigger, much more current city of Brazilians, where Jews live. His name was Rabbi Yosef Whiteman, and he decided that a mascaras for a community is not complete with just the physical edifice that used to belong to the community, meaning just refurbishing a shul that belonged to a community from hundreds of years ago does nothing for said community. And he decided to go and collect all the chuvas and the psakim and the drushes that were written and said by the great rabbis of Recife in the 1600s and publish them in a sefer. Because the true way to remember a community is by the words of its Talmidei Chachamim and then whatever took place in that community. Now that ended up being a 3-volume set of Svarim called Kisvi Rabbi Yitzchak Abu of Fonseca, the Chachmei Recife. The Ksavim of the Rabbi Yitzchak Abu of Recife, where he was the Rav, and other contemporary Chachamim in his day. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak Abu of Fonseca is the third of the Rabbi Yitzchak Abuavs. There's probably more, but there's 3 famous Rabbi Yitzchak Abuavs. There's Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav, who was a Rishon. He wrote the Menorahs Hamar, which is a Mussar Sefer. There's Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav, who was from the quasi-Rishonim Achronim, who was like a Rebbe sort of the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef quotes him as Harav HaGadol, like an older contemporary of the Beis Yosef. And then the third Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav was Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav, who was a Rav in Recife, who had been a Rav in Amsterdam, had been a Dayan in Amsterdam, and ends up moving to Brazil to become a Rav there. Now, it's a little bit odd. This part is a drop of conjecture, but it's a shtickle odd that a brand name Rav who had been a Dayan in Amsterdam in a big Kehila ended up like on the farthest stretches of the world, in Recife as a Rav for almost 2 decades. And I started wondering why he might have ended up there. And I came across in the Sefer and elsewhere that there's 2 very prominent Moshe Bezdin's or Dinei Torah arguments that took place in Amsterdam when Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav still lived there, and it might explain how he ended up in Recife. And I'll tell you as follows. So Inyan number 1 this is like a famous chayrim, one of the most famous charamas that ever took place in the Jewish world, is the chayrim of Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza. I'm sure some people heard of him, some people didn't hear of him. Benedict Spinoza was a Jew from Murano stock, like all the Jews in Amsterdam was. The Amsterdam Kehila in the 1600s, we're talking about in the 1600s, was all Jews who had formerly been living as Christians, for a certain tkufa of their life. They came back and they were, building a new community. And in 1600, give or take, they ended up in Amsterdam. They started one shul, another shul. Ultimately, they combined into like a Kehila umbrella, where they formed like one main Kehila for the whole Kehila of Amsterdam, for all the Murano Jews in Amsterdam. And they had many shuls, many yeshivas, many chesed organizations. I saw a list of like all the chesed organizations and stuff. It would sound very familiar to what we have. It would sound very familiar to what you're used to. Lamashal, they had a chevras Baal Tshuva, first of all. They had like a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. It was called B'Chavras Baal Tshuva for Baalei Tshuva who were coming back at the time. They had Beis HaChaim, which has to do with the dead, Bikur Chaylim, Pidin Shvuyin, Chayin Dalim, Chesed Ve'emes, Gvul Almana. They had like endless stock organizations that would sound very familiar. There was yeshivas, Eitz Chaim, Keser Torah, Torah Ar, Tveres Bachurim. You go anywhere now, you're going to find yeshivas with the same names, Chesed organizations with the same names. So they built themselves into a very substantial kehillah in the 1600s in Amsterdam. And they had very chashuv dayanim. They had the Av Bezdin at the time was someone by the name of Shalom Mortara. He was the Av Bezdin. He was a very traditional, classic Talmud Chacham, and also a big philosopher and darshan. The svarim that we have from today is a sefer called Givat Shaul, which is 45 drushes on all different inyanim in the Torah. So Shalom Mortara was the Av Bezdin, and then some of the members of the Bezdin was Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav, this person that we're talking about, the protagonist of our story, Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav. The Menashe ben Yisrael was a dayan in that Bezdin, and other Moshe the Aguilar, other famous, Sephardi, Marano family Rabbanim. Now, the Reb Shalom Mortara, the Av Bezdin of Amsterdam at the time, had a Talmud by the name of Baruch Spinoza. Now, Baruch Spinoza was a bright, precocious young man. He came from a very poor family, and he sat and learned by Reb Shalom Mortara for years and years and years, until in his late teens, he seems to have had a major, major break with Yiddishkeit. And not that he wanted to be fry, he didn't care to be fry, he didn't care to become Christian, he didn't care to convert, he just had like a major hashkafic break with Yiddishkeit. And you read the biographies written about Baruch Spinoza for the first, a good chunk of after he was dead were written by Catholics, Christians who were enamored of him. So they tend to paint the Jews in a bad light a little bit. But they say that they tricked him, they got him to say his true opinions, which is not such a terrible thing to do. I mean, people knew what he held, and they tricked him, they got him to say his true opinions. They hold him into Bezdin in front of the Dayan, Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav de Fonseca, this Dayan who we're talking about, and he said, I'm going to give you a chance to take back what you said. You're a young man, could be in the heat of the moment, you said something that's too far that you don't really mean. He said, no, this is what I mean, I'm not backing down. And depending on which version of the story you read, it's very dramatic. His Rebbe, Reb Shalom Mortara, comes in and pleads with him and begs him not to go down this route. Chazar b'cha, and he won't. He refuses to. And ultimately, Baruch Spinoza is put into Gehenim by the Kehillah in Amsterdam in a very conclusive and definitive manner. He's pushed out completely. They go to the government. They convince the local government to even banish him from living in Amsterdam. And he moves to, I think, Helsinki in Finland. He writes some very, very, very famous philosophical, books that make him an icon and a legend in the secular world. He's one of the fathers of modern philosophy. If there's something called the religion of science, like prioritizing science above everything else, he's like a head priest of the religion of science. And he becomes totally, totally alienated from the Jewish community. But in an interesting twist, he never converts. He never becomes anything else. So he's just a bad Jew. He's not, meaning in those days, especially in the Marano community, if you weren't interested in being Jewish, you became something else. You would become Catholic, you become, Dominican, you could become whatever, you could become something else. He was just a bad Jew. Now, the reason why I point this out, why it's so relevant, is because later generations of bad Jews very, very much tried to rehabilitate Baruch Spinoza and turn him into a hero. Because Baruch Spinoza was the idea of a person who said, I'm not going to relinquish my claim to being a Jew, I'm just not going to be Jewish. Meaning, you understand the chiluk? I'm still a Jew. Just because you say that I'm not a Maimon in Tchias HaMesim, or Chazal, or Mashiach, or Gan Eden, or even God, big deal. I'm still a Jew. I was born a Jew. You can't un-Jew me. That was Baruch Spinoza's claim. And therefore, like Jews who always wanted to push for secularism, like Moses Mendelssohn, and later on some of the early secular Zionists were extremely busy pushing Baruch Spinoza as a hero. Because he was like the prototype that you could be a Jew without being Jewish. For example, in 1920-something, 30-something, on Hebrew University campus in Manskopus, a famous secular Jewish Zionist by the name of Yosef Kleisner, got a Polish Yid, but he was not from it all. He got up on at the end of like a maracha about Baruch Spinoza, and he said at the end of it, Baruch, achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata, which traditionally in a Bezdin, if you're being mater acherim, and the way the Bezdin would be mater acherim, is they would say, achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata. So you had a totally non-religious secular Zionist in Yerushalayim in 1935 being mater the cherim of the Bezdin of Amsterdam from 1646. meaning he was such a firebrand, something that was so important to secular Jews to attach themselves to, because he showed you could be a Jew without being Jewish. Now, because of this, fault line over there, Shalom Ratara himself was somewhat like blighted by having had to do with Baruch Spinoza. But the fact that Baruch Spinoza was his Talmud, in many Svarim of the day, you'll see people like put like an asterisk, like they refer to Shalom Ratara with like an asterisk. Now, over time, that went away, and more so than that is when his Sefer was republished in Warsaw in 1915. They got a haskama from Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, which is not so common, and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik writes in it that Shalom Ratara is, a Gehenim, a great man. He doesn't need my haskama. The Teichen of the Svarim doesn't need a haskama from someone like me. Befrati says that the Ber HaGoyla, Rav Moshe Ravkash, who's the Vilna Gaon's grandfather, writes about Shalom Ratara that he's a Gaon and a tzaddik, and this is true in the Hakdama to Even Ezra. The Ber HaGoyla writes about Shalom Ratara that he's a Gaon and a tzaddik. He quotes him lahalacha and some in Yud Zayin. So he says Befrat that the Ber HaGoyla already, was masmich, put his hands on him and said that he's a Gaon and a tzaddik. So he's above reproach, and we don't need to do anything about it. And because of this haskam from Chaim, the Madfis of the Sefer, who we have both editions of it, in his first edition, in the Hakdama, when he writes about Shalom Ratara, he writes like this asterisk. He writes that like Biyamav, Baruch Spinoza was a Talmud of his, and etc. And by the time the second edition of the Sefer was republished, a few years later, that's completely taken out, and you could see the contrast, meaning like how he writes about him just like it's, without question. There's no asterisk, and with asterisk is gone. So there are those who hypothesize that Rav Chaim Soloveitchik is the one who took away the asterisk on Shalom Ratara, which is like a very interesting turn of events. That Rav Chaim Soloveitchik should be the one to lift the blight on Shalom Ratara like that. In B'chalev and Shia, this is something that took place at the time. Now, what this arose and why this was so unique to the Marano Jews was Marano Jews who had been Catholics, who were struggling to be Jews, who were somewhere trapped in the middle between being Jews and being Catholic, were very troubled by what does it mean to be a Jew? Meaning, what makes you a Jew? Could you be a Jew even without being a Jew? Could you be a Jew just if like your mother was a Jew? If you just think about being a Jewish? Like, how much Jewish do you have to be a Jew? And because of the Shaila, this led to like this big fight with Baruch Spinoza, which was a big Cherem. Now over there, the Rabbanim who signed on to the Kilas Cherem was Ritzchak Abuav, Rav Shalom Ratara, possibly Rav Menashe ben Yisrael, and a fourth Dayan. So meaning that was something that all the Dayanim and the Bezdin seeming to have came in concert with and said that someone who's Makchish Torah Misinai, who's Makchish even more than that, it can't be a Jew. Now what was Baruch Spinoza's main Hakash, and this is not really relevant to our story, but I'll share it anyhow, was in short, and this is obviously an oversimplification of his views, but what he held was nature is God. So there is no such a thing as a God. Nature is God. The fact that everything works and that everything stims and that everything clicks and does on its own, that's God. What humans refer to as God is just nature. It's nature is God. So he founded like the religion of science, like that science is everything, nature is God. Now, this was something that's connected to Torah, and he was put into Cherem. Now, interestingly, and I digress here for 1 second, is this quote of nature is God that he said got another famous Rav into a lot of trouble shortly after that. The Sephardic Rav in London in the late 1600s was someone Rav David Nieto. He wrote a sefer called Mata Dan, Kozri Hasheni it was called. Rav David Nieto gave a drasha in Shul, where he said, we have a quote of the drasha because he sent the letter to the Chacham Tzvi, and it's published in Shailas Shuvas Chacham Tzvi later on. But he said as follows, he says, people say about me that I say God is nature is God, and how can I say that? That's a kfira, it's not something that's appropriately acceptable to say. He says, it's true, I say it, I do say it, and it's true, and I'll explain to you why. And he goes to say how HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashkacha extends to everything that a person needs. He's Merid Matar, he brings the food, he gives everyone what they need, he takes care of each person. So he says, I ask you, is nature not God? Meaning, the fact that every human is taken care of so well that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashkacha extends to what every single person needs in every single day, and that's through nature that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Mesav, that everybody gets what they want. He says, I ask you, is nature not God? And he refused to back down. Now, this was a community that was still struggling with these exact shilas, of how far could you push the envelope and still be considered acceptable. They sent a letter to the Chacham Tzvi, suggesting that they should remove Rav David Nieto as their Rav. And Rav David Nieto writes a letter to the Chacham Tzvi explaining what he said. He writes the drasha, it's about a page long, he writes what his speech was. And the Chacham Tzvi says, Avada, what you're saying is correct. Chacham Tzvi says, Kfira is to say that nature is God. But to say God is nature, that's very posh. He says, why? Because God is nature is the answer to all these people who are pursuing the religion of science. Meaning people like Baruch Spinoza and people who follow him, who are prioritizing science and making sense of everything and trying to understand how everything runs and how it works and what the system is. So for them it's important to say that God is nature. Meaning, yeah, of course, everything you're going to be able to uncover and everything you're going to be able to find, that's just the depth and the understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha. You want to see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, you're just understanding how Hashem runs the world. But that nature is God, that of course is Spinoza, and that's Kfira. So Chacham Tzvi in a tshuva, the Chacham Tzvi does not have 10,000 tshuvas. Chacham Tzvi has a few hundred tshuvas. One of them is literally about explaining the nuances of Kilu Baruch Spinoza's Kfiridic position in contrast to a acceptable position which would be similar. So these were the shilas of the day, Kilu, that were pressing them. Lamashal, we find in many different tshuvas of the day, shilas of like, what is the Jewish status of a Marano or of a crypto Jew, of someone who isn't practicing as a Jew. The Rivash in Shilas Tshuvas, in Shut Rivash, in Tshuva Dalid, right away in the beginning, he handles a shaila of wine that was pressed from the Anusim, from people who were Anus, meaning people who were still living as non-Jews, and they pressed the wine. What would be the din? Are they Jews? Are they not Jews? And he goes into an entire arichas of the Tshuva to explain the P'tor of Einus and how the Torah looks at somebody who's forced to do something. A very, very sympathetic portrayal and accepting view of these Jews who were trapped in this hard situation, meaning allowing them to say, even if you're not holding by living up to everything at this moment, and you're still trapped in a situation that doesn't allow you, still the Rivash was looking at them with a positive eye. The Rivash has many tshuvas, about 4 tshuvas I think, where he discusses this, where he pursues this idea. The Tashbits, the Marashdam, the Mabit, every one of these poskim were handling shilas about who's a Jew, how to look at these Jews, could they be looked at as Jews, could they be included in Jews. Now, this shaila probably came to the biggest fight that arose about this question happened between these two dayanim who we've been talking about, between Rav Shalom Mortara and Yitzchak Abuav. They got into a huge disagreement about this very question, and I'll explain how. Rav Shalom Mortara gave a drasha in shul. He was the Abbezin, he gave a drasha in shul saying as follows. He said that people who live their lives as Goyim, meaning they're born Jews, by their bloodline is Jewish, but they live their lives as Goyim, and they don't do anything to be Jewish. They have the opportunity, they're in a kehillah like Amsterdam, where they have the opportunity to come back around and to live their life properly, and they don't. He says these people are going to go to Gehenim forever and ever. He says, L'dayrei dayris. Gehenim kol v'heimenim kol. They're gone. They're eradicated from the Jewish people. Essentially, meaning we all know the Mishnah, the famous Mishnah in Sanhedrin, that says, Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik l'olam haba. We say it by Pirkei Avos, Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik l'olam haba, which implies any Jew, no matter how much he strays, Yisrael shechata haf b'shechata Yisraelu. Meaning no matter how far he strays, every Jew has a chelik l'olam haba. They're going to be able to get out of the Einshim of Gehenim and eventually go to Gan Eden. Go to, have some Tchiyah Elamis. And what Rav Shalom Mortara said in his drasha was that no, if you're a Jew who isn't Jewish, meaning if you're not Jewish b'chlal, you're not, related and connected to being Jewish, you're not going to have anything. You're going to be gone forever and ever. So Hikilu extended the potential for Einshe Gehenim much, much further than what people had in their mind. Meaning the Gemara says, and we'll go through each one of these Gemaras, the Gemara seems to limit Gehenim. The Gemara says 11 months. The Gemara says different things. The Gemara Chazal seem to have limited, how far a person can go to Gehenim. The Mishnah says, a Stam Mishnah Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik l'olam haba. So it seems like every person has an opportunity. Rav Shalom Mortara came and he said, no, if you're not Jewish, just being a Jew is not enough. And he said, you'll go to Gehenim, l'dari daris, we'll never hear from you again. Now this ignited a firestorm in his shul. The kehillah in Amsterdam was a kehillah that was a blended kehillah, mixed of these different elements of Jews who were Jewish, who were less Jewish, Maranos, half Maranos, people who were coming back, they weren't back yet, people who had family, meaning you could have someone who was totally from, but had 3 generations of grandparents who had lived as Catholics completely, and for him to hear that his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were never going to be seen from again, never going to be heard from again, was a very harsh message that was hard for them to deal with. Now, of course, there's a great value in this message. The message is the stakes are high. You can't just say, I'm a Jew, I'm good to go, it doesn't matter how I live in life, it doesn't matter what I do. Meaning his message is extremely valuable message to Kehillah like this. The stakes are high. You have to make it back in time. Shuv yamechel lefnei misascha. You have to make it back in time. You can't just skate and think everything's shalom yinafshi, everything's going to be okay. But this ignited mamash like a firestorm, and people interrupted, and people pushed back, and they said, it can't be this way. And then eventually, the Rav, who became the standard bearer of the Tachik Keneged, was Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav. Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav spoke against it, wrote against it, and said that no, based on many different sources, that a person, every Jew, no matter how far he strays, will eventually have a way back and will come back, and he brought many, many sources. Now, this fight was raging in the Kehillah, and because they couldn't settle it, they decided to send a letter to the Kehillah in Venice, which was a more established, Sephardic community, to ask the Bezdin in Venice to be machriya the shaila. I think by us this is like a strange thing here, like a Batei Dinim that we're fighting about what exactly the sentence of Gehenim is. Meaning Gehenim is a life sentence, it's not a life sentence. Like it's a very strange, like it almost seems like very irrelevant to our perspectives. But in the perspective of the day, these were very relevant questions that had to be debated. So they sent the Shaila to the Bezdin in Venice asking, what's, be machriya between Rav Shalom Murtara's position and Rav Yitzchak Abuhav's position on the matter over here. And the Bezdin in Venice said that we don't want this Shaila to go onto Bezdin's records because it will look bad we don't want the Goyim to see that we're talking about this. We don't want them to know how we look at this. We're not going to talk about it. But they sent him a letter from the Askin of the Kilo, the chief Askin of Venice, who I believe his name was also Abuhav, or Avram Abuhav, not Dafka related to Yitzchak Abuhav. Avram Abuhav, he's the father of Shmuel Abuhav, the Dvar Shmuel, who has another famous Shuvah Sefer. There's a lot of Abuhavs, but the Rav Avram Abuhav writes to the Bezdin in Amsterdam a whole arichastic letter where he strongly sides with Rav Shalom Murtara and says that Lamaisa, I hear what you're saying that Al Pi Kabbalah and Al Pi different sources that you have, that Nishmas Yisrael is very heilig and it's never going to be Leman Yidach Men Nidach, it's always going to come back. I hear what you're trying to do, I value what you're trying to do, but Lamaisa Rav Shalom Murtara is quoting very mephoristic sources, very basic sources, and you can't argue on the idea that a person could stray so far that he could go to Gehenim and lose everything. Because he says the Mishnah itself, the Mishnah from where you're coming from, that says Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik elam haba, literally continues and says Ve'elu she'ein lam chelik elam haba. The next line in the Mishnah is Ve'elu she'ein lam, and the Gemara, the Mishnah delineates who loses it, what they lose it for. The Mishnah says some Hadyotis who lost it, some Malachim who lost it. There's many Chazals clearly themselves held that just because they said Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik elam haba doesn't mean there was an ironclad rule. Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik elam haba. So the Bezdin says, not the Bezdin, but the Askanim of Venice say, we instruct you to back down from your position and stop arguing publicly with Rav Shalom Murtara. Meaning they instructed him to take a back seat. You have to back down and not argue with Rav Shalom Murtara. What he's saying has to be considered the basic hashkafa that people have to have in mind. Now, it would seem, and this is a little bit of conjecture, but it would seem that after these great fights, when the Steller came up in Recife for Yitzchak Abuhav to take, he jumped at the chance, meaning to have to stay here and deal with these major, combative battles that were going on. It wasn't so exciting to him, and he jumped at the chance to go to Recife, which ultimately worked out and didn't work out. Meaning the Kehillah lasted there for about 15 years under Dutch rule. Eventually, the Portuguese take it back, and they again start the Inquisition there, and they have to all leave, and he ends up back in Amsterdam again. At the end of his life, he ends up back in Amsterdam. But this is the Kehillah, the Machlekes, that was the impetus for him moving on. Now, I just want to share, before we wrap it up, a few of the sources that are motivating this machlekes. So in the Sefer, we don't have Rav Shalom Murtara's drasha anymore that he gave. But over here you have like a 3-page synopsis that Rav Shalom Murtara wrote, or that Rav Yitzchak Abuhav wrote for him, of what his position is. And Rav Shalom Abuhav writes as follows. He says, he's fakert, he's being a kanoi. He says, I heard Chadashim Bikar Boyu, new people who are not motivated to be Jewish b'chlal, who say, don't worry, as long as you're a Jew from b'makar, you're going to be good to go. You're going to have Gan Eden. Gehenim's going to go away from you. You're going to be fine. He says, and I find that to be unacceptable. He says, I found people who are saying, "Mizera Yehudimu, ki yipol layutal, ki Hashem semich yada asher chazdem ye'olam v'adolam." If you're from Zera Yehudi, you come from Jewish stock, Hashem will take care of you. You're going to be fine. V'machshela azay yatzim mitachas yedei maskilim ha'imrim ki lahem yad v'shem v'chachmas ha'kabbalah. He says this maskela, this weakness came forth from people who think that they know Kabbalah. He says, "Lemechiach b'shar Yekushin v'am le'yavan yilakat." When he says, "V'hiya yoyim b'darshi b'rab," he says. So I think this is Rav Shalom Murtara writing this. He writes, when I was giving my drasha in public, he says, "Bali yadei in yanei haKabbalah hanamenes." This is a very interesting, sarcastic remark. He says, "Bali yadei haKabbalah hanamenes hamakubelas b'chol Yisrael." It came to my hand the real Kabbalah, the Kabbalah that has Messiah, that everyone agrees with. He says, "What's that?" Habraisa Anishnas B'Perakam Rosh Hashanah. So he's being sarcastic. He's saying, don't tell me you found in the Kabbalah Sefer it says X, Y, and Z. It came to my hand. Pasha, he's making I came across this obscure old Kabbalah Sefer called Masechtas Rosh Hashanah, where it says as follows. He says, "Aval haminim v'hamoisrim v'apikarsim shekafru b'atayra v'shekafru b'tchiyas hamesim v'sheparshu midarkei tzibur v'shenasnu chitim beretz achayim v'shechatu v'shechtiu as harabim k'en yiravim v'nevat v'chaver." It's a long list of various different people. He says, the Gemara says clearly, Yarden leGehenim, they go down to Gehenim, v'nidainim ba l'dairei dairis. They're sentenced to a term that's l'dairei dairis, which implies forever. Generations upon generations. Shenemar v'yetz v'yatzav v'rob pigrei anashim ha'poshim. Fine. Then the Gemara says, Gehenim kala v'heimenim kalam. Gehenim will come to an end, and they still won't be done being burnt. So he says, I added on many more Gemaras and Chazals and different source material that implies clearly that someone could blow it, could lose it so badly that he's not going to have anything left to go back to. And he says, and if you're going to tell me that this is just a Gemara, but it's not lahalacha l'maisi, he says, I'll show you that the Achronim, now keep in mind, he's writing in the 1600s, so he calls Achronim is what we would call Rishonim. Achronim that he's referring to is the Rambam, the Ramban, the Mordechai, the Rosh. That's who his Achronim are, which is, keep that in mind. He says, V'achronim, ulam Achronim asher al piyam anu chayim, u'memeyam anu sheisim, lo'inatu yimin v'smol min hadavar hazeh. They didn't move, not right or left, an iota from this thing. V'lei lamadnu davar acher. He says, Kinu lefaneinu roisham edabim Rambam peragimul d'chus tshuva. The Rambam says, ve'elu hein she'ein lam chelik elam haba, l'nechrasim v'oivdim v'nidainim al goydel risham v'chatam l'olam u'l'ol me'elamim. So the Rambam writes clearly, there's a list of people who are so mufka from having a future that they go to Gehenim and then nidin l'dairi dairis u'l'ol me'elamim. Hafikaris markay from Matayr, etc. He says the Ramban likewise in Shara Gmul says this as well. He says then he throws this in again, a little sarcasm. He says Vina Ramban mekubul gadol v'chasid. The Ramban knew Kabbalah the way you say Kabbalah, meaning what you're lecturing me for not knowing. He says Ramban knew Kabbalah, and he also says this. He never for some reason told us what you're telling us. Then he continues. He finds a Rush that holds like this. Then he quotes from the Marik. That the Marik says anytime the Rush, the Rambam, and the Rif agree to something, and that's the halacha psuka. So he says, I found you that the Rif, the Rambam, the Rush, the Ramban, and etc. all hold like this. Learn this Gemara Kapshuta that a person could be so mufka that he could go to Gehenim and stay there. So there's nothing to talk about. This is halacha psuka. It's over. And he says, you should accept this. Something that it says in the Nevi'im, the Ksuvim, the Mishnah, the Brisa, the Tosefta, the Talmud, Rambam, Ramban, Rif, Rush, Ran, Rav Zrachia, Maria Barbanel, Balakeda, Rabbeinu Bachaya, Rabbeinu Yoina, Menachem Erikanti, Maria Bua, Balmaneris Amar, not the Maria Bua who he's arguing with. He quotes many, many, many svarim that he found that seem to learn this Gemara Pshuta, and he therefore says it's not even a conversation. It's open and shut. Of course, a person could stray so far that he loses his Jew card, meaning that he loses his ability to say Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelik Elam Haba. Now, he says this, that he's doing this as a kanoyis. He says, "Bekanoyis eskinas Hashem elikid tzvakas." I'm doing this to kilu stand up for Yiddishkeit and say, no, you can't just say separate Jew from Judaism. Meaning, if you're not Jewish, you're also not a Jew. That's the premise of his whole piece. Now, I can't really go into the answer. The rebuttal is Ritzig Abu of his Machberes Nishmas Chaim, which is like a 20-page maracha, where he finds many Kabbalah sources. Some early, some late, some very modern, some very recently to him, who all talk about the Kedusha of a Nefesh Yisrael and how it can't be separated, and eventually, no matter what, it will come back, it will have a tchiyah, it will have an ability to have some sort of Gan Eden. And he has a long rebuttal to this. Now, the part that caught my eye, that really tied it to what we were talking about last week, was that he says, that he has a few paragraphs where he says that even if it's talking that a person could lose his own chelik l'olam haba, and you have nothing to stand on, a person could have no leg to stand on, he could lose it. He says, but he brings many different sources that the tzaddik hadairis, the tzaddikim who pass through Gehenim, he writes, or come near Gehenim, will be able to take you and you'll be some sort of second fiddle to the tzaddik. Some sort of, really what he's coming off is a Gemara that says that when the ashes are fully destroyed, the Gemara says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes, he collects the ashes, umefazrun tachas raglei tzaddikim. He spreads them under the legs of the tzaddikim, which he learns based on many different Kabbalah svarim means that even someone who loses his own ability to stand on his own two legs will be mefazrun tachas raglei tzaddikim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will gather them back in and collect them their ashes. So now this is just, I can't go into all his sources and whatever. If someone wants to read more about the exact pratim of Gehenim, you can take a look at the Reishis Chachma in Shara Yira and Parakid Gimel. He brings a brisa called Masechtas Gehenim, which describes in great vivid detail the exact mechanics of Gehenim. Or you can look at the Ramban in Shara Gmul, which is the end of a Sefer Teres Adam, which is the Hilchos Avelos. He writes like the neshamas. What happens to the neshamas? Avelos is what happens to the bodies, to the people who stay behind afterwards. What happens to the neshamas? And he goes into Baricha. So someone wants more about the exact pratim of Gehenim, the Shem Shel Gehenim, where exactly Gehenim could be found. There's much more to talk about, but I'm not really going to go down the rabbit hole. What I just wanted to highlight was this integral. You said this like a machlokes between these Gedolei Achronim. If Gehenim is like a life sentence, if a Jew who's not Jewish goes and that's it, he's cut off the tree, or Gehenim for all Jews is the same, meaning some will get more, some will get less, but Gehenim just means it's a clarification process. It's not really something that destroys Jews. And the reason why I went down this rabbit hole is because the Maria Bov relies on the same thing that this Chassidish story by the Bach was told upon. Okay, Mitzvah, we're going to go right to some more halachic Gehenim in the next few weeks. To be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.